My son and his wife threw me through a glass door. The glass shattered. I was bleeding. They called it an accident. I sat in that cold kitchen, alone, thinking maybe I was really worthless now that I had no paycheck. But what they never knew is that I had quietly inherited $21 million. They thought I had nothing left. What will they do when they realize I could buy and sell everything they own in cash? I never expected to see my own blood on the kitchen floor, not in my son's house, not at 71. It happened on a Tuesday. Snow had just started falling outside, soft and steady, like the hush before something breaks. Bradley and Juliana had been tense all morning. I made myself small, the way older women sometimes do when they sense their presence is no longer welcome. Juliana stood at the counter, arms crossed. Her voice was sharper than usual. "You're still holding on to the deed, aren't you?" She didn't need to raise her voice. Her tone sliced clean enough. I looked at her, then at Bradley. He didn't meet my eyes. He just stood there, fiddling with his phone, as if this conversation didn't involve him. But it did. It involved all of us. The house still had my name on it, and they didn't like that. I knew they had been planning something. Whispers, missing mail, locked drawers. But I had kept quiet. I said calmly that I wasn't ready to sign anything, that maybe we could sit down later and talk it through, maybe after dinner. Juliana didn't wait. She took 2 steps forward and pointed toward the back door. She said I needed fresh air, that I was being emotional, that it was better if I stepped out. Her hand gripped my arm, not hard at first, but firm. Then something shifted. Bradley, still silent, moved beside her. I remember his hand brushing mine, like he meant to help me walk. I remember the tightness in his jaw. The next second, I was falling. My back hit the glass. There was a loud, dry crack. Then everything gave way. I landed outside, half in snow, half in shards. Cold bit into my arms. The smell of blood mixed with the bitter scent of pine and winter. For a moment, I thought I might never get up again. But I did. I always have. From inside, Juliana shouted that it was an accident, that I lost my balance, that they were trying to help. But they didn't open the door. They didn't come to check, not even Bradley. I stood. My hand was bleeding. My coat was torn. Snow soaked through my shoes. And yet all I could feel was a stillness, not shock, not pain, just stillness, like something inside me had snapped back into place. I turned away, walked down the driveway, not a single word. It wasn't the first time they made me feel like I didn't belong, but it was the first time I saw it clearly. They wanted me gone. They had plans for this house. And in their eyes, I was no longer the mother who raised him. I was an obstacle, a signature, a delay. I didn't go to the hospital. I went to the diner on 4th and Maple, sat at the back booth, ordered coffee with extra cream. The waitress didn't flinch when she saw the blood. She just handed me a napkin and said, quietly, "Take your time." And I did. That night, while the snow kept falling, I booked a rental car and checked into a motel. My hands still ached, but my mind was sharper than it had been in years. I knew I had to act carefully, quietly. I wasn't going to scream or beg or play victim. I was going to do what I had always done best. Observe, think, move. They thought I was weak. They thought I was finished. But they forgot who built this life in the first place. They forgot who made sure they never went hungry, who covered their college loans, who co-signed their mortgage. They forgot. But I didn't. If you're still listening, thank you for being here. Some stories don't start with a smile or a celebration. Some start with broken glass and the silence that follows. But silence, when chosen, can be powerful. and mine was just beginning. Would you have walked away or stayed? Tell me, quietly, in your own heart. Because the next part, that's when everything started to change. I stayed at the motel for 3 nights. It was the kind of place where the sheets were always cold, and the ceiling fan made a soft ticking sound like an old clock running out of time. But it was quiet, and no one asked questions. I needed quiet more than I needed comfort. The morning after the glass incident, I got up early. My hand had swollen a little, but I cleaned the wound and wrapped it again. I made myself a list. Just 4 things. Simple. Measurable. Things I could control. At the top of the list was one word: proof. I had always trusted my instincts. I spent decades reading people in boardrooms and mediation rooms, diffusing conflict with nothing more than a calm voice and the right choice of words. But this wasn't work. This was my life, my son, my home. The lines had blurred slowly over time, until I couldn't tell if I was living with family or among people waiting for me to leave. I remembered something from a few months earlier. A quiet afternoon when Juliana took the kids to her mother's and I had the house to myself. I had installed a small camera back then. Nothing fancy, just a backup. It was tucked into the corner of the bookshelf, disguised as a little ceramic owl. I told no one. I never thought I'd need it. But after that moment at the door, I knew. I called the friend who helped me set it up, Maya, an old colleague from the hospital network. She worked in compliance and tech security, sharp as a tack and never asked unnecessary questions. Within hours, she recovered the footage and sent it to my private drive. I watched it once. Only once. Bradley's hands, Juliana's voice, the angle, the sound of my body hitting the glass, the sharpness of the break. Then silence. There was no denying it now. This wasn't just hurt feelings. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was assault. And they had covered it with silence and false concern. All while eyeing the house I had paid off 27 years ago. I called a lawyer the next day. Her name was Nadine, a woman in her 50s, with a voice that sounded like gravel and steel. She didn't ask for drama. She asked for documentation. I gave her everything. While she began drafting a case for elder abuse and property coercion, I started packing the rest of my plans into motion. I visited the bank, quietly. Withdrew enough to move things quickly, but not loud enough to raise flags. Most of my funds were untouched, still tied in municipal bonds, a private real estate trust, and a separate account linked to a trust fund left by an old client. 21 million in total. It had taken years, but it was mine. I had never spoken about it to Bradley. He assumed my retirement came from a modest pension, that I lived on Social Security and leftovers from his father's account. That assumption kept him comfortable in his entitlement. And Juliana, she never imagined I might be more than what I looked like. Grey hair, soft sweaters, quiet mornings, easy to dismiss. But I had been building something they never bothered to see. I rented a short-term apartment in town under a different name. Just a month-to-month lease with no frills, no noise. I didn't need a view. I needed space to think. The first thing I placed on the counter was a folder. Inside it was the footage, a printed copy of the house deed, my living will, and Nadine's first draft of the complaint. Then I sat down, breathed in, and for the first time in years, I let myself feel everything. The betrayal, the humiliation, the deep ache of being seen as disposable by the very people I gave everything to. But beneath the ache, something else had started to bloom. A quiet resolve. Not to punish, not to destroy, but to reclaim. Not just my name on paper, not just my house, but my space, my dignity, my place in the world. And I knew this was only the beginning. I woke up that morning before the sun rose, not out of restlessness, but clarity. There was a strange comfort in the quiet of my new apartment. The hum of the heater, the faint traffic from a nearby road, the hollow sound of my slippers on the kitchen floor. I boiled water for tea and stood in front of the folder I had placed on the counter the night before. It was a plain black folder, nothing special. But what it held had weight. Inside were 3 documents. The first was a printed copy of the house deed. My name was still there, clear as daylight. No joint ownership, no transfer signatures. I had held off signing anything for years, always feeling a small pull in my gut that said wait. That wait had saved me. The second was a ledger of my financial holdings, not for pride, for facts. Most of the money had come in over decades, through quiet investments in long-term care housing, hospital systems, and wellness centers across 3 states. Former clients had left pieces to me in their wills, trusts, or just plain gratitude. I never spent much. I never needed to. I had enough. The third was the security footage, a still frame printed on the cover page. My face. My hands in the air, the moment before the fall. I closed the folder gently. Today I would begin filing the formal paperwork with Nadine. But before that, I needed to look backward. One last time. I pulled out an old notebook from my purse, the kind with the green cloth cover, the edges worn soft. I had used it to jot down things over the years. Conversations, dates, notes from when I started feeling like something was off. It wasn't the big moments that built the full picture. It was the little ones. Like the time I noticed the mail being sorted before it reached the kitchen table, or how Bradley insisted on managing the utility bills himself, even though I had always paid them. The questions Juliana asked, casual but calculated, about who would inherit the house, or if I had updated my will. And then there were the papers I never saw again, my social security statements, the envelope from the bank. I remembered one day I asked if my Medicare card had arrived, and Juliana had waved me off, saying she had put it somewhere safe. I never found it. Alone in the kitchen of that quiet apartment, I realized what I had been feeling wasn't paranoia. It was preparation. They weren't waiting for me to die. They were preparing for me to disappear, quietly, without fuss, without questions. I took a long sip of tea and stared out the window. Snow had returned again, fine and steady, covering rooftops like dust on forgotten shelves. After breakfast, I dressed with care. Not out of vanity, out of purpose. Grey trousers, black turtleneck, wool coat, the same coat I wore when I signed my first leadership contract at the hospital in 1984. That coat had seen the inside of more boardrooms than most junior partners ever would. I carried the folder into Nadine's office at exactly 10 o'clock a.m. Her assistant, a brisk young woman with short hair and clipped sentences, led me into a room with bookshelves lined in legal binders and framed citations. Nadine sat behind a clean desk. No clutter, no photos. Only a pen and a yellow legal pad. She didn't offer small talk. She didn't need to. She opened the folder, flipped through each page, and nodded. It took less than 30 minutes for her to confirm what I already knew. I had a case. Not just for assault, but for financial manipulation, coercion, and willful neglect of a dependent elder. Colorado had clear laws on elder abuse, and Nadine had worked with judges in cases like this before. Quietly, without media, but firmly. I asked her to keep everything sealed. No public filings yet. I wasn't looking for headlines. I wanted resolution. She agreed. We would move slowly but deliberately. By noon, I had signed the preliminary affidavits. By 3 p.m., Copies of the footage had been secured in 2 locations. And by sundown, I was back at the apartment, sitting in the same chair by the window, the folder now thinner but heavier in impact. It would still be weeks before charges were filed, maybe longer before the court date, but the motion had begun. And once something like this starts rolling, it cannot be undone. That night, I didn't sleep much. My body ached in places it didn't before. My hand still had a slight tremor from the injury, but I no longer felt small, or forgotten, or invisible. I knew the people I raised didn't see me clearly anymore. They saw what they thought I represented: obstacle, liability, delay. But they didn't know everything. They didn't know the funds had already been moved to a separate holding company, that the trust had been updated, removing all heirs until further notice, that the title of the house was not only still in my name, but now legally shielded by a revocable trust. And most of all, they didn't know that the woman they tried to erase had already written the next chapter without them. It would be weeks before they noticed anything missing. But the silence I left behind would grow louder with time. 3 days after I left Nadine's office, I received a quiet call just after 8 a.m. Her voice was even, calm. The paperwork was filed. The complaint was officially entered into the court's system. She told me not to expect anything dramatic at first. These things take time. But it had begun. I didn't speak much on the phone, just a soft, "Thank you." Then I hung up and stood in the middle of my small kitchen, letting the silence speak louder than words. That same afternoon, I drove out to a private postal centre near the edge of town. I handed over a pre-sealed envelope with 3 printed items inside: a copy of the complaint, a lawyer's letter requesting the return of any and all house-related documents, and a notice of restricted contact, effective immediately. The address on the envelope was Bradley and Juliana's. I didn't linger. I didn't look back. By the time I returned to my apartment, snow had started falling again. This time, heavier. The kind of snow that presses everything down, makes the world quieter, like a lid on a pot slowly building pressure. I sat by the window and opened my notebook. Flipping back to older entries, I saw how I used to write down things that felt too small to matter. But now they read like a pattern, a strategy. Juliana had once accidentally signed for my medical statements. That was 4 months ago. Bradley had offered to update the property tax info online for me. That was last winter. They had tried to place me on a new phone plan, told me it would save me money. Instead, I lost access to my banking app for 2 weeks. All of it subtle, all of it calculated. I made a new list that day, not of what I had lost, but what I still had full control over. The deed, the trust, the footage, the law, and most important of all, myself. The following morning, Nadine emailed me a case update. The court had issued a preliminary review date. Nothing public, no arrests. But if things continued as expected, the footage would be used as direct evidence, and a temporary restraining order could be placed. I didn't celebrate. I didn't breathe easier. But I felt something settle inside me. Not relief, not satisfaction, just alignment. That week, I also met with Marcus, an estate planner I had worked with years ago during the restructuring of one of my older clients' retirement portfolios. He was reliable, discreet, and always treated me as if I still wore the title from the hospital, even though I hadn't in over a decade. I told him to prepare documents that would move the bulk of my holdings into a new foundation, a non-profit trust to support career retraining and wellness resources for women over 60, especially widows, especially those who had given everything to family, only to find themselves discarded once they were no longer needed. Marcus didn't blink. He asked smart questions, gave me timelines, told me what was possible and what was wise to delay. I left his office with a binder of drafts and a calendar full of quiet steps. Outside, the streets were slick. Pedestrians moved carefully. I walked slower than usual, not because I was tired, but because I could afford to now. For the first time in years, I wasn't rushing to prove anything. I spent that night going through old photo albums, not out of sentiment, out of truth. I wanted to see the moments I had forgotten, the smiles that were real, the holidays where the warmth didn't feel rehearsed. One photo stuck out. Bradley, at 12, sitting beside me on the hospital lawn, eating a sandwich I had packed in a lunchbox. His hair messy, his arm looped around my shoulder. He wasn't cruel then. He was just a boy with too much emotion and not enough space to process it. I held that photo for a long time, not to justify, but to remember where we had come from, so I could fully understand where we had arrived. A few days later, I received a voicemail from Juliana. Her voice was tight, professional. She said they had received my lawyer's letter and were surprised at the accusations. She hoped we could resolve this privately. No apology, no regret, just control. She sounded more worried about the paper trail than the glass shards still buried in my coat pocket. I didn't respond. Nadine would handle all contact moving forward. I wasn't going to argue. I wasn't going to explain. Instead, I prepared. I made copies of all documents, stored them in 3 separate locations. I scheduled a second appointment with Marcus to finalize the transfer of the first portion of the funds. I purchased a new jacket, grey wool, heavy, built for cold days and long walks. The old one, the one with the bloodstain on the sleeve, I folded and placed in a sealed bag. Not to forget, but to preserve the line between before and after. Then I went for a walk. The wind was sharp, but I didn't flinch. My body had adjusted to discomfort. But my mind was clearer than ever. They thought pushing me through glass would break me. What they didn't realize was that some glass breaks clean, but the woman standing on the other side can come out sharper, not bitter, just precise. And now I had precision, and paperwork, and patience, and the law. The apartment grew quieter as the week went on. Snow piled against the window ledge and swallowed the outside noise. Each morning I woke with the same rhythm. Tea first, then documents, then walking. It became a kind of silent ritual, one that helped me stay sharp without slipping into sadness. On the 5th morning, I drove west into the mountains. I didn't tell anyone, not even Nadine. I left early, just after sunrise, with a small overnight bag and the new coat. I had made a reservation under a different name, a habit I had picked up during my years managing high-profile hospital staff who needed discretion. Some things never leave you. The road twisted through tall pines and frozen lakes. The sky hung low, grey and steady. When I arrived in Aspen, it was nearly noon. The snow was thicker there, fresh, untouched. The air felt cleaner than anything I had breathed in weeks. I checked into a small cabin near the springs. Nothing extravagant, but clean. A fireplace, a view of the slope, a full kitchen I wouldn't use. I wasn't there for leisure. I was there to breathe in silence, to remember who I was before the noise began. That evening, I soaked in the outdoor pool. The water was warm, almost too warm against the cold air, and I stayed beneath the surface longer than usual. Not to forget, but to empty myself, to make room. The next morning, I woke early and sat on the wooden deck, wrapped in a blanket. I sipped coffee and thought about the version of myself that used to make excuses for how Bradley treated me. The woman who used to say, maybe he's just stressed. Maybe he's just protecting Juliana. Maybe I misunderstood. I had stopped making excuses the day my back hit glass. Now I looked back with sharper eyes. and I began making new outlines, not for court dates or documents, but for how I would live if I no longer needed to explain myself to anyone. That same day, I walked into town and stopped at a quiet bookstore I used to visit years ago. The owner, a woman named Ruth, still remembered me. We didn't talk much. I picked out a few books, mostly about quiet women who changed their lives late in life, and left without announcing who I was or why I was there. I didn't need to be the woman with the folder, not today. By the third day, the cabin felt like it belonged to me, not because I owned it, but because I had brought myself there by choice. There's something powerful about reclaiming space, even if temporary. It's the difference between escape and return. I wrote letters that night. Not to Bradley, not to Juliana. Letters to myself. To the version of me at 40 who spent birthdays alone because the family forgot. To the version at 50 who helped them buy their first house but wasn't invited to their housewarming. To the version at 60 who had quietly paid their credit card debt when they couldn't make the minimum. I wrote to each of those women and told them they did what they could with the knowledge they had. I forgave them, and I thanked them, because without them, I wouldn't be here, strong enough to walk away, smart enough to plan ahead, quiet enough to let truth do the work. That night, the snow turned violent. Winds howled against the windows, rattling the glass, reminding me how fragile walls can be. But the fireplace stayed lit, and the roof held strong. I didn't feel unsafe. I felt awake. The next morning I checked out early. The road back was slick and steep, but I didn't rush. At every curve I thought about what came next. I knew Nadine would be preparing the next filing. I knew Juliana would probably try to respond with some version of charm or outrage. I knew Bradley would do what he had always done, go quiet, then passive, then resentful. But I wasn't going back into that house. I wasn't going back into that old version of myself either. Instead, I drove straight to the building that held my newly registered foundation. The paperwork was finalized 2 days before. I hadn't told anyone, not even Marcus. It was my private start. I walked up to the receptionist, handed over my ID, and smiled when she looked up and said the name of the foundation. I asked her to say it again, just so I could hear it aloud. The Montrose Initiative, a place for women over 60 to rebuild. Quietly, powerfully, on their own terms. She handed me the welcome packet. I thanked her, walked into the small office that had been reserved for me, and sat down in the chair behind the desk. No ceremony, no applause. But inside, I felt something shift, something real. Bradley once told me I was too sensitive, that I needed to stop taking things so personally. Now, I took things personally on purpose, not out of pain, out of clarity. Because sometimes, after the snow settles, you realize the path wasn't lost. It was just covered for a while. And now, I was walking it on my own. The first time I saw Juliana again, it wasn't in a courtroom or over a phone call. It was at a property showcase. I hadn't planned it that way, but life has a strange rhythm once you stop trying to control its tempo. The firm she worked with was hosting a tour of newly renovated homes on the outskirts of Denver. One of the homes, a minimalist 5-bedroom ranch style with open beams and Scandinavian interiors, had been funded by a private investment group. What Juliana didn't know was that the group had recently come under new management. Quietly, discreetly. That management was me. I had arrived 10 minutes early, wearing dark sunglasses and a long coat. I didn't need to hide, but I also didn't want to be the center of attention. I walked the house like any other guest, listening to Juliana's polished voice as she explained the imported tile, the underfloor heating, the solar panel rebates. She looked the same. Perfect hair, firm voice, that overly gracious tone she always used when she was selling something. I watched her gesture to a couple, both younger than her, about the upgraded kitchen. She smiled in a way that didn't reach her eyes. When she turned and caught sight of me, I saw her expression flicker, just for a second. Then she composed herself. She wasn't sure whether to acknowledge me. I didn't give her the chance. Instead, I walked into the master bedroom and ran my fingers along the windowsill. The air smelled of cedar and lemon oil. Everything was staged. Nothing felt lived in, just like their marriage. Chloe, her assistant, followed me. She was young, sharp. I had seen her once at a family function years ago when she was still new to Juliana's team. Now she wore a tailored suit and held a clipboard. She cleared her throat behind me and said, in a tone more arrogant than necessary, that this was a private showing. I turned slowly and looked her in the eyes. I didn't need to raise my voice. I simply handed her a business card with the name of the investment firm. My name was listed under strategic partner. Her eyes scanned it, then widened. She stammered something about checking with Juliana. I told her to take her time. I'd be in the sunroom. 10 minutes later, Juliana came in. She didn't greet me. She didn't ask why I was there. She just looked at the card in Chloe's hand, then back at me. I saw the panic beneath her calm. I asked her if she had reviewed the latest sponsorship ledger. She didn't answer. I already knew the answer. The company she worked for had taken a bridge loan from a group of silent backers for that particular renovation. When I had assumed management of the fund, I became a silent partner, not for power, for positioning. Juliana stood rigid, her eyes calculating. I could almost hear the gears turning in her head. She knew this wasn't random. She knew this wasn't a coincidence. I told her simply that everything had a paper trail, that all things left behind eventually lead back home. And then I left. I didn't wait for a response. I didn't need a confrontation. That wasn't the point. The point was to remind her that she had underestimated the wrong woman. That evening, I sat alone at a small cafe just outside the city, sipping black tea as the sky turned a deep purple. A young waitress asked if I needed anything else. I smiled and said no, thank you. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel invisible. Later that night, I checked my email. Nadine had forwarded new correspondence from the court. The investigation had officially moved from preliminary review to active motion. There would be interviews, depositions, and if necessary, hearings. She had also included a list of evidence items now sealed for the case. Among them was the footage from the night of the incident, sworn affidavits from 2 neighbours who had heard the argument, and the financial history of Bradley's attempts to consolidate my utility bills under his name. It was slow progress, but solid. That same week, I received a notification that the trust paperwork for the Montrose initiative had gone through. The bank confirmed the first transfer had settled. $5 million, set aside for operational costs and long-term endowments. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. I thought about what Juliana might have told Bradley when she got home from the showcase, whether she softened it or whether she let the full truth sting. I would never know. That part didn't belong to me anymore. What mattered was that the ground beneath their feet had begun to shift, and I was no longer standing still. I didn't hear from Bradley directly, not at first, but the silence itself was telling. For someone who had always managed to insert himself into every conversation, every room, every choice I made, his sudden retreat spoke volumes. Juliana, however, couldn't help herself. Less than a week after the showcase, I received a forwarded message from Nadine, a carefully worded email from Juliana's legal team, claiming there had been misunderstandings and emotional misjudgments during the family dispute. They suggested a resolution outside of court, one that involved mutual agreements, privacy, and, unsurprisingly, the immediate cessation of all pending motions. They wanted a deal. I didn't respond. Nadine did. Her reply was brief. The process would continue. No further commentary would be entertained outside official channels. The email chain stopped there. Later that same day, Marcus called. He wasn't the type to panic, but his voice had a tightness I hadn't heard before. He had received an unexpected inquiry from a third-party real estate group asking for ownership verification regarding one of the parcels linked to my trust. Apparently, someone was trying to poke holes. I asked Marcus what he needed from me. He paused, then told me he already handled it. The documents had been reinforced months ago, thanks to the restructuring we had done early in the year. There was nothing to worry about. Still, he wanted to keep me in the loop. After we hung up, I sat in my living room, staring out at the slow drift of snow. I wasn't surprised. I had expected pushback. But this was something else. This was desperation disguised as strategy. That evening, I reviewed the list of properties Bradley had once asked me to co-sign for, back when he and Juliana were still building their business. At the time, I had declined politely. Something about the way he had worded it, like it was my duty as a mother, made me hesitate. I hadn't known why back then. I just knew it felt wrong. Now it felt like instinct had protected me. Quiet, stubborn instinct. The next morning, Nadine sent another update. The preliminary discovery phase was closing. The court had approved the next step. A pre-motion hearing would be scheduled, and with it, the release of evidence to both sides. That meant the footage would no longer just be a quiet file stored on a private drive. It would become a matter of record. I spent that afternoon walking through the local arboretum, even though the paths were half frozen and the benches cold. There was something comforting in moving forward while everything else seemed to be standing still. As I walked, I thought about the last Christmas I had spent in that house. Juliana had ordered catering. Bradley had barely spoken to me. The grandkids had been glued to their tablets, uninterested in the gifts I had carefully picked and wrapped. I remembered placing a glass ornament on the tree and seeing my reflection distorted in the silver surface. I didn't know then that it would be the last time I'd sit at that table. But now I was glad I hadn't known, because I might have stayed too long out of guilt. And guilt was no reason to keep bleeding. Later that week, the court issued a formal notice. The hearing would take place in 2 weeks' time. It wouldn't be dramatic. No televised drama. No packed room, just a judge, a few attorneys, and documentation. Still, it would be the beginning of truth being spoken aloud. Meanwhile, I kept moving. I met with the Foundation's first round of advisors, women from different parts of the state. Some had lost their spouses, some had lost their homes. But all of them had one thing in common. They had been overlooked. As I listened to them share their ideas, I realized something. For all the silence I had endured in that house, for all the times my voice was softened or dismissed, I had never truly lost it. I had just been speaking to the wrong people. After the meeting, one of the women walked up to me. Her name was Janice. She had soft eyes, but her voice had weight. She told me she had seen the way I listened, not just to reply, but to hold space, to make room for someone else's truth. It was the kindest thing anyone had said to me in a long time. That night, I pulled the folder out again, the one I had kept since the beginning, the one that held my medical files, financial records, copies of the trust, and the external hard drive containing the video. I placed it in a new fireproof safe I had installed in my apartment the week prior, because it was no longer just protection. It was preparation. The house Bradley and Juliana had tried to control was no longer theirs. The bank had frozen the line of credit under review. The mortgage had been flagged. Everything was starting to shake beneath them, and they had no idea how still I had become. Because stillness, I had learned, is not weakness. It is waiting with intention. And I was done waiting. It started with a phone call from Nadine on a quiet Thursday morning. Her tone had changed. It wasn't sharp, but it carried a weight I hadn't heard before. The house, my former house, was officially under investigation. The footage had been reviewed by both the court and a special division that handled elder abuse. They were taking it seriously now. She said there would be an official site visit. Officers would be sent out, not just to collect more evidence, but to walk the ground, to see the place where it happened, to observe the setting in its real, physical context. Juliana had been the first to call the court that morning, apparently frantic, apparently caught off guard. I didn't feel satisfaction, not even relief, just a stillness, like watching the first crack spread through the surface of a frozen pond. I didn't ask for details. Nadine said she would handle everything. What I needed to do now was stay steady. No contact, no sudden movements. The process was working as intended. Later that day, I sat at my small dining table, my fingers resting on the soft edge of the teacup. The snow outside had begun to melt slightly, a rare moment of sun cracking through the weeks of cold. I let it land on my face through the window. Quiet, warm, unbothered. That afternoon, I received a message from an unfamiliar number. Short, no greeting. "Your neighbors are talking. What are you doing to us?" There was no name, but the number was tied to Bradley's phone. He hadn't spoken directly to me in months, not since the night he pushed me, not since my blood soaked into the floorboards of a house he no longer controlled. I didn't respond. I passed the number to Nadine. She flagged it for documentation. That evening, I went walking through the city, not far from the courthouse. I passed by one of the legal offices that had once rejected my claim when I came in without a lawyer, just a bruised wrist and a tremble in my voice. They hadn't even offered a consultation, just a polite nod and the number to a hotline. Now I walked past without bitterness. I had Nadine now. I had a file the size of a hardback novel. I had official attention. At home, I reviewed the timeline again, not because I had forgotten, but because I needed to remember how long it had taken for truth to take shape. The fall, the silence, the hospital, the questions, the apology that never came, the first email to Nadine, the footage transfer, the quiet filing, the first letter, the pushback, the showcase, the moment at the sunroom, the call from Marcus, the trust established, the hearing scheduled, and now the site visit. None of it happened overnight, but together it had built something undeniable. The next morning, I received word that the officers had visited the house. They had spoken with the neighbors. One of them, Mrs. Kendall, who lived 2 doors down, had given a sworn statement. She said she had seen me leave that night with a torn coat and blood on my sleeve. She had been afraid to say anything before, afraid of disrupting the neighborhood, afraid of being dragged into something ugly. But the footage changed that. It wasn't a matter of opinion anymore, it was fact. Nadine told me there was growing talk inside the court about formally charging both Bradley and Juliana, not just with assault, but with endangerment and intentional concealment of evidence. They had waited too long to claim it was an accident. They had done too much to cover it up. That weekend, I visited the office of the foundation again. There was a new sign on the wall now, a soft ivory plaque with the name in raised silver letters, the Montrose Initiative. A young woman greeted me at the door. She was just 23, interning while working toward her nursing degree. She smiled brightly and offered to show me around, not knowing who I was. I told her I preferred to walk alone. She nodded, respectful. I moved through the small space slowly, room by room, looking at the shelves of books, the boxes of supplies ready to be delivered to rural libraries and senior centres, the stack of grant applications for wellness workshops written by women who had lived quietly too long. I lingered in the conference room, ran my hand along the edge of the table, sat down for a moment and looked out the window. A life can look ordinary on paper, but the decisions that shape it often come quietly, unannounced, uncelebrated, like sitting in a courtroom not as the accused, but as the witness, like hearing your son's name spoken aloud in legal tone, like knowing you didn't raise your voice, but you raised the truth. I left the building just as the sun dipped behind the trees. On the drive home, Nadine called again, this time with something new. The county clerk had received a sealed filing from Juliana's attorney, a request for early mediation, voluntary, private, a last attempt to avoid formal charges. It meant only one thing. They knew what was coming, and they were afraid. I pulled the car to the side of the road, rolled the window down, let the air sting my face. I didn't feel victorious. I felt awake, alive, unbroken. The court date wasn't loud. There were no flashing cameras, no packed gallery. Just a small courtroom on the second floor of the county building, its windows facing a row of grey trees that had long since lost their leaves. The hearing room was cold and smelled faintly of old carpet and paperwork. I arrived 10 minutes early, dressed in navy slacks, a dark sweater, and my late husband's watch. Not because it brought me comfort, but because it reminded me of the years I had spent holding everything together for others. Today was not about memory. It was about ownership. Nadine was already seated at the table, her briefcase open, papers arranged in rows like soldiers. Her calm presence steadied the air. She nodded to me without words, then looked back down at her notes. Across the aisle, Bradley sat stiffly beside his attorney. His suit didn't fit well. Maybe it was borrowed. Maybe it no longer belonged to the man he was trying to be. His eyes flickered toward me, then dropped immediately to the table. Juliana entered 3 minutes later. She wore all black and no jewelry, not even her wedding ring. She didn't sit beside Bradley. She took the next row back, alone, arms folded tightly across her chest. The judge arrived, a woman in her 60s with steel grey hair and a voice like dry wood snapping. She didn't look at anyone for too long, just read the file in front of her, called the room to order, and began. It started with the clerk reading the charges. First, misdemeanor elder abuse, then obstruction of reporting, then attempted coercion of property through emotional manipulation. 3 charges, each followed by a long pause as they echoed into the space between us. I didn't look at Bradley. I didn't need to. Then came the evidence presentation. Nadine stood, precise and focused, and presented the footage. A large monitor had been rolled into the room, facing the bench. No sound, just the video. I had only watched it once, in a motel room, alone. Now I watched it again, but I did not flinch. My eyes stayed on the screen the entire time. Bradley's arm reached across the frame. My body staggered back. The glass shattered. I disappeared from view. Silence, then the video ended. There was no gasp in the courtroom, just stillness. Even the judge sat motionless for several seconds before writing something down and signaling for the next item. Then came the statements. Nadine kept it short. She didn't dramatize. She spoke only of facts. My injury, the delay in reporting, the attempts at intimidation, the documentation of asset transfers Bradley had attempted weeks before the incident. A pattern. She called it subtle, but clear. Bradley's attorney responded with deflection. Stress. Miscommunication. A family argument taken out of context. A moment of unintentional harm. He painted a picture of a son pushed too far by misunderstandings. Then Juliana was asked if she wished to make a statement. Her lawyer leaned in. She shook her head. No words. Her silence was the loudest thing she had ever said to me. The judge didn't deliberate long. She didn't hand down a full sentence. This was only the evidentiary hearing. But she did rule that the case would proceed to full review, that the evidence warranted further action, that the protective order I had requested would be extended. Bradley was ordered not to contact me in any form. Juliana as well. Financial access frozen, shared accounts under audit. The investigation would expand. When the gavel came down, I didn't exhale. I just stood, nodded to Nadine, and walked out of the room without looking back. Outside, the wind had picked up. Leaves scraped across the sidewalk like dry whispers. I walked slowly, deliberately. Every step felt earned. At the cafe nearby, I ordered a small black coffee and sat at the corner table. No one recognized me. No one needed to. I opened my notebook and drew a line through today's date. Then I turned the page and wrote one sentence. I am not broken. When I returned home that evening, a letter was waiting for me. Not email, not a phone call, a physical letter, handwritten. It was from Bradley. The envelope was plain. The handwriting was uneven, like his hand had trembled while writing it. He said he was sorry. He said he had been under pressure. He said he didn't know what came over him. He said he didn't expect it to go this far. He asked me to remember the boy he used to be. I read it once, then again. Then I folded it and placed it in a drawer I rarely opened, not out of bitterness, but because forgiveness is a process, not a performance. That night, I sat by the window with the lights off. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just sat in the quiet, letting the night hold its weight. The house they tried to take had been restored to my name. The deed corrected. The will updated. My foundation had gained its non-profit status. We had our first official board meeting scheduled in 2 weeks. There were lives I would help change. Not out of revenge, but because I could. And that was power. Not the kind that shouts, the kind that builds. I sat on the edge of the guest bed in my new apartment, the letter still tucked away in the drawer across the room. I hadn't touched it again since that night, but I'd thought about it. Not the words he wrote, but the things he didn't say, the things he didn't seem to understand. All those years, I held my tongue. I let myself shrink in corners. I let them speak over me, correct me, dismiss me with soft smiles and patronizing silence. Not because I didn't know better, but because I thought love meant choosing peace over pride. That day in the courtroom, when he couldn't look me in the eye, I finally understood. I had given too much. I had raised a son on fear, not the kind that shouts, but the kind that whispers quietly. Don't push too hard. Don't expect too much. Don't disappoint. And now I was seeing that child reflected back in the man, a man who had learned that guilt could be brushed off, that apologies were enough, that forgiveness was automatic. I stood up and walked to the window. Snow was falling again. The city never truly stopped moving, but there was a calm in the rhythm of it. I breathed slowly. For once, the tightness in my chest was gone. The next morning, I attended a community roundtable hosted by the foundation. We gathered in a rented hall at a library branch just outside Denver. Dozens of women came, some alone, some with daughters, some with notebooks full of dreams they had put off for decades. I watched them speak, nervous at first, then stronger as their voices met nodding heads and understanding eyes. There was something holy about the way they listened to one another. No judgment, just shared ache and quiet recognition. During a break, a woman named Felicia sat beside me. 65. Recently divorced. Her son had moved away and barely called. Her eyes were kind but worn. She told me she used to think becoming invisible was just part of aging. that it was normal. Now she wasn't so sure. I told her that I had once mistaken silence for strength, too, that I had thought not asking for anything was a kind of virtue. She laughed softly and said, "Then maybe it's time we rewrite what strength looks like." Later that evening, as I walked to my car, I passed a small bookstore near the corner. There was a sign in the window, "Local authors reading next Saturday." I smiled to myself, then kept walking. It wasn't about being seen. It was about finally seeing myself clearly. At home, I prepared tea and opened a blank notebook. I didn't plan to journal. I just wanted to feel paper again. It reminded me of when I used to write notes for Bradley's school lunches. Little encouragements. "You've got this. I believe in you. You're stronger than you think." And now, I was writing those same words to myself. The next morning, Marcus called. The final audits had come back. Every attempt Bradley and Juliana had made to touch my assets had failed. The fraudulent requests, the disguised inquiries, the manipulative paperwork filed just days before the incident, all documented, all blocked, all traceable. Marcus's voice carried a quiet pride. He also told me something I didn't expect. A law student working under his mentorship had offered to take the case further, not for more punishment, but for precedent. The footage, the documented pattern, the silence I endured. It all painted a picture of systemic elder abuse that often went unseen. She wanted to write about it, raise awareness. I gave my consent. Not because I wanted my story to be told, but because I wanted others like me to know they weren't alone. That same week, Juliana's name was removed from 2 properties she had tried to leverage. The bank had reversed the transfer. She had no legal claim. And Bradley? His accounts remained frozen. The judge had set a review hearing for financial restitution. And yet, I didn't feel triumph. I didn't need it. What I felt instead was a soft clearing, a quiet path opening before me, no longer tangled with confusion or dread. That weekend, I went back to Aspen. I walked the trails I had first found months ago, when I ran from the chaos, unsure of what was next. This time, I walked them not as someone escaping, but as someone returning. On the last stretch, as the sun began to dip low, I stopped near the ridge that overlooked the valley. I closed my eyes. I thought about that night. The glass, the silence, the ache in my chest as I waited for an apology that never came. And I whispered softly, not to him, but to myself. "You didn't deserve that. Not the push, not the neglect, not the years of being talked over, looked past, depended on only when convenient. Not the assumption that you would always be there, always say yes, always stay small. You didn't deserve any of it. And you survived it anyway." That night, I slept without waking once. The first full sleep I'd had in years. No memories chasing me through the dark. No whispers of what I could have done differently. Just rest. Just breath. Just peace. It was never about revenge. It was about reclaiming the voice I'd buried beneath years of quiet. And now that I had it back, I wasn't going to let it go. I walked into the office that Monday morning just as the first snow began to fall again. The Montrose Initiative had grown since the last board meeting. The walls were no longer bare. They held framed photographs of the women we'd helped. Smiling faces, graduation certificates, business licenses, letters from daughters who watched their mothers rebuild. In the main room, I saw the new coordinator setting up for a workshop. She looked up, offered a nod, then went right back to organizing. That small moment felt like something I never thought I'd experience again. I wasn't being tiptoed around. I wasn't being handled. I was just another person doing the work. I walked past her and into the quiet conference space we now called the Founder's Room. I opened the side drawer and removed the sealed packet I'd been holding onto for months. Inside was the last of the financial paperwork. The full transfer of my remaining assets into the trust fund. $21 million. It still didn't feel real. And yet here it was. Signed, sealed, legally untouchable. Not just for tax protection, not just for image, but because I wanted the money to outlive me in a way that didn't carry blood or guilt. I sat at the long table and read over the final statement. Everything had been processed. The lawyers had double-checked every number. There was nothing left with my name on it, except for one line. Permanent designated use. Empowerment of older women in transition. I took a pen and signed the last page, slowly, carefully, as though I were signing a goodbye to a version of myself that used to be afraid of her own worth. That evening I drove to the old house one final time. The new owners were a retired couple from Oregon. They had never heard of Bradley or Juliana. They were told the house had been tied up in probate and that it took longer than expected to reach sale. They hadn't asked much beyond that. They just wanted a quiet home near the trails. I stood across the street, engine still running. The porch light was on. Wind chimes swayed softly under the eaves. I could barely see the crack in the new glass door. They had replaced it, but the frame still held a faint mark where the original had splintered. I didn't need to walk up. I had no desire to reclaim it. I had already done that, in a different way. As I turned to leave, my phone buzzed. A message from Nadine. The final judgment had been released. Bradley would be placed under a restricted order of financial access for 5 years. He would be required to undergo counseling for abusive behavior toward vulnerable adults. Juliana had agreed to settle, relinquishing her claims on shared property and withdrawing her pending appeal. There would be no trial. And just like that, it was over. Not loudly, not with headlines, but with signatures and silence. I drove back to my apartment and sat for a while in the car, letting the weight of it all press gently against my chest. There had been no scene, no screaming, no confrontations in hallways or bitter phone calls, just quiet consequence, the kind that grows slowly and lands where it's supposed to. I went inside and opened the window. The snow was still falling, but soft now, like ash after a fire has burned itself out. In the weeks that followed, I rarely thought of Bradley, not out of spite, but because the version of him I had carried for years no longer lived in my mind the way it used to. The father of my grandson, the boy I once held through the flu, the man who forgot I was human. He would carry his own consequences, and I would carry something else. Peace, clarity, purpose. In one of our staff meetings, a young intern asked me how we decide who receives support. I told her we look for women who remind us of who we used to be, not because we're trying to save them, but because we want to stand beside them while they learn to save themselves. She smiled and nodded, and I knew she understood. That night, I sat by the window again, pen in hand. Not to write a letter, just to mark the day, I wrote one line. Justice isn't always loud, but when it's real, it doesn't need to be. And I underlined it, slowly. Once. Then I closed the book and turned out the light. The lake behind my apartment froze in early January. I had watched it slowly still over weeks, ripples becoming reflections, and finally silence. That morning I walked the trail around it with a cup of coffee in my gloved hand, scarf tucked into my collar. The air was cold, but not bitter. It didn't sting the way some winters used to. It felt clean, like something had finally settled. I had just left the last board meeting for the quarter. We reviewed the numbers, the impact reports. Over 200 women had come through the program that fall. Some were now employed, others were in training. A few had moved into housing provided through our new partnership. One woman, Donna, in her 70s, had started her own bookkeeping service. She had cried in my office when she got her first 3 clients. I remembered what she said, hand trembling as she showed me the checks. I thought life was done with me. Turns out, I just needed a second wind. As I passed the bench near the big willow tree, I stopped and sat. It used to be hard for me to sit still. I always felt I had to prove something, show I was useful, needed, unshakable. But I had learned that being quiet wasn't the same as being invisible, and being strong didn't mean being silent. The phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a message from Nicole, my granddaughter. She had sent a photo, just a simple one. A sketch she had drawn of a woman sitting at a window, cup in hand, looking at the snow. Underneath, she wrote, "I remember you like this." I didn't respond. Not yet. My heart was still too full, not with grief, but with something heavier and softer. Forgiveness, maybe. Not of Bradley, not of Juliana, but of myself. For all the years I thought my value depended on how much I endured without complaint. I walked back slowly, feeling the crunch of snow under each step. When I reached the door, I turned once more to look at the lake. Then I stepped inside and closed it gently behind me. Later that night, I packed a small suitcase. Not for a trip, exactly, but for a few days up in the cabin near Aspen, the one I'd purchased quietly and restored without telling anyone. A place that felt entirely mine. Before I left, I took one last look at the mirror in the hallway. My reflection didn't shock me like it used to. The lines were still there, the grey still threaded through my hair, but the eyes were different, not hardened, just clear. I whispered something only for myself to hear. You kept going. And I meant it, because I had, through the doubt, through the betrayal, through the silence, through the long nights of thinking maybe I'd imagined it all, that maybe I had been too much, or not enough. But I had been enough all along. I just needed to remember how to stand on my own ground. And now, I had. If you've ever chosen silence because no one would listen, if you've ever been dismissed or forgotten by the people you love, then this story was meant for you. Share how you feel after hearing this journey. You never know. Your words might be the light someone else needs while walking through their darkest moment. We read every comment, even the quietest whispers. This isn't just a storytelling channel. This is where silence gets heard.